All right. So today we're going to be setting up a Solana Validator. This is mostly a walkthrough. I'm just going to be following this documentation you see on the right-hand side of the screen. I will link it down below. It should be pretty easy to follow, but definitely let me know in the comments if you have any questions. I found that the documentation that I used to make this documentation, you can see here, AG Gels, was a pretty thorough guide and was pretty easy to follow. I think the thing that I needed to diverge on most was around the partition of the hardware and the accounts database versus the ledger database. And that was mostly due to the server that I'm using. I'm using a Lumen server provided by the Solana server program. That too was pretty easy to set up. I hadn't used bare metal infrastructure before, mostly cloud, AWS, DigitalOcean, etc. But I found it to be a pretty easy experience setting it up and not too dissimilar from the deployment using cloud infrastructure. Maybe just takes a little bit longer. Okay, so to start, we're going to set up our server, our firewall, and our user where the Solana program will actually be installed. So as you can see, I've already logged in to the server using SSH. There's credentials that you set up through the Lumen Edge platform. So I won't be covering SSHing into the server, but depending on what you use, you can definitely figure that out. So to start, we'll update the server. And then we will add the user's SOL. Next, we'll create the firewall. These firewall rules, again, some of them are specific to the testnet, particularly these UDP ports that allow for you to communicate on the P2P network. They're slightly different for the mainnet, so take note of that. But for the most part, this should be the rules that you need to use, with the UDP ports changing a little bit based on what cluster you're targeting. And another thing to make sure when you're doing this is before you enable it, make sure that you have enabled SSH so you don't lock yourself out of your server. Check the status. You can see all our rules have been added. And just one other note. So this user that I have that is credentialed, this is a non-root sudo user. This is where you'll install the system services, whereas the Solana binaries and the actual Solana program, when you're entering Solana commands, that will be on the sole user. Okay, so now we're going to partition the disks. Obviously, this will be specific to your setup, but as you can see here, the pre-configured server that we received through Lumen is showing us one of our 3 NVMe drives. We have two 1 terabyte NVMe drives and one 480 gigabyte NVMe drive, which is what you're seeing here. This is where the OS has been installed. Definitely took me a while to figure out exactly how this was working, but you can see these here. So first, we're going to resize the OS disk to allow more breathing room and use up some of that empty space. You can see here how we're set up, the partitioning of this NVMe, 480 gigs, 150 here. So that's now grown our partition. You can see the partition that the OS is on is now taken up all of that empty space. And now we're going to resize the specific partition, the logical, the LVM. Now you can see that the LVM has been significantly expanded. And this is where our operating system is on. So a little more headroom here. To be honest, I'm not fully sure how necessary adding all that space is, but it makes me feel more comfy. And you have a lot of control in Solana over the size of certain databases. So it's not room that we should need for other purposes. So now we're going to create a partition that will eventually be used to store the ledger data. In Solana, there's two key parts to the blockchain. From a database standpoint, there is the ledger data, which is all of the transactions and blockchain activity. And then there is the accounts data, which is all the accounts and their associated information. You can see we've created this partition here. And format the file system on that partition. I'm going to create a directory for the ledger. Going to mount that directory to the partition that we've just created. And this is the UUID of the partition. This is going to be important. Copying this into a little notepad. We're going to add a line you can see below to the fstab file, which allows us to persist this partition and this configuration that we've set up. Now to check that these changes were made successfully, we're going to unmount and then remount our directory. Check that we see the lost and found. There it is. And then final step for the ledger database is going to be to make sure that the sole user has ownership over this directory. The third step on the partition side is going to be creating the accounts DB. This is a multi-step process that involves some optimizations that are listed in the Solana documentation as optional. But once you really dig into it and understand the requirements to keep up with the blockchain, you realize that they're more mandatory. And so this involves creating a RAM disk, as well as a significant amount of swap space to extend the capacity of the RAM on your device. So we'll start by creating the partition that all of this is going to live on. And we're not going to use the entirety of the partition. So this is our third NVMe drive that we're using here, the second 1 terabyte NVMe drive. We're going to use 60% of it for what will eventually become the RAM disk, and then the rest will be used for the swap. See here that the partition has been created. It's about 60%. File system. It's the directory. Sorry, I'll clear so we can go up top. We're going to mount the newly created directory to our partition. And again, we're taking note of the UUID here, which we will add to our fstab to make sure that these changes persist. Just as before, we're going to unmount and remount the directory to make sure that these changes have indeed been persisted. Great. And once again, making sure that the directory is owned by the user sole. Now we're going to create the RAM disk within this new partition and directory that we've created. And we're going to add this line, which does the creation of the RAM disk. These are all parameters. You can see the size here, 300 gigs. This is what is recommended in the Solana documentation. And you can see the user sole. And we're going to run the mount command to make sure that this change was made successfully. You can see successfully mounted. Once again, making sure the user sole is the owner. Now we'll be creating the 250 gigs of swap as recommended in the Solana documentation. So we can see we already have a swap file. We're going to remove that swap file, make room for ours. See, it's no longer there. Going to make sure it's gone in the fstab file as well. And now we're going to create the swap partition. So here we are using the remaining space on that partition that we created. See, here's our new partition. File system for this new partition. Create the directory for the partition. Mount the partition. Again, taking note of the UUID. Sure to add it to fstab. Using a little notepad off screen, I advise you to do the same. And to check that the changes are persisted, we're going to unmount the directory, remount the directory. Check that we see our lost and found. There it is. It's to the top of the screen here. Okay, so this command gave me a lot of trouble. It took me a while to fully understand what was happening here, but we are creating the swap file, and we are creating it in our newly created directory. This count is 250,000 bytes, or 250 gigs. And when running this command, it takes several minutes to do it. 250 gigs is a lot, so not surprising, but I definitely was impatient. And around minute 5, 6, even minute 7, I typically get a little nervous, but just be patient, and it should work. Okay, so I'm going to give it this little bit of time and come back and we'll finish the swap. All right, and you can see now it's finished. For my own sanity, it started timing this process, and that took about 6 minutes and 45 seconds. So yeah, definitely just be patient if you see it hanging. And now we're going to make sure that this has the right file permissions. And we are going to create the swap file. Now we're going to add the swap file parameters so they persist. We're adding them to fstab. And we're going to increase the swappiness. Put that through properly. And now we're going to turn the swap on and make sure everything looks good. So that looks good. You can see our sizing here. See it from another angle right here. Here's our 250 gigs of swap. check out how our memory usage is going. So there you can see this is the system memory, only about 1.4 gigs being used right now. And this is the swap that we created. Okay, so next step, we are going to download and configure Solana. So we have our user Solana. We're going to log in. Right. Okay. So make sure you have the most updated version, which for me at the time of recording is version 1.10.8. And as I state here, take note of the path. That's going to be important for some other files that we're setting up to make sure that these files have the correct access path to the Solana binaries. Takes a sec to fully download and extract. Cool. Okay, as I say there, we're going to log out and log back in. These changes take place. And now we're going to point our Solana configuration at the testnet cluster. See here. Okay, so now the Solana binaries are set up. And the next step is to create the accounts that we're going to use for our validator. So this is another step that took me a while to fully understand what I was doing and why. There's several accounts that you need for running a Solana validator. Two that are of extreme importance from a security standpoint, and two that are hot keys that need to be used to submit transactions on chain. So starting with the authorized withdrawer, this is definitely the most important account. This is the account that controls your validator. So we are going to create this key and not store it on the device. When you use the flag no out file, that makes sure it doesn't output it to a file on your device. You can see in some of these later ones, we store the key pair on the device. This is so the validator can access it as it needs it to sign transactions. But you do not need to sign transactions in the operation of the validator with your authorized withdrawer, only when you're trying to change the validator identity or the vote account or make some withdrawals. So we'll generate this account now. Your passphrase. Okay. And again, you want to practice proper key management when storing this, offline. And also going to airdrop Sol. Drop a Sol. We're going to airdrop some Solana to our newly created wallet address. All right, next we're going to create our validator identity. Again, keeping the key somewhere safe, though it will be stored on the device. And I'm also going to airdrop it some SOL. I have here in the documentation something that AGGel had in theirs, which was to do a transaction just to kind of test that your accounts are operational. But I'm just keeping it easy and doing the airdrop for the purposes of this walkthrough. Okay, so now we're going to create our vote account. Okay, now that our vote account is created, or the vote account key pair is created, we're going to actually create the vote account. You have to run a command for this. So I have both the format up here and then how we would do it with our current setup. So as you can see here, this is the withdrawer public key. So that's going to be something we need to change based on the withdrawer that we just created. Again, just using my little notepad off screen here. So you can see we're referencing our vote account key pair, our validator key pair, which is our identity. And then here is our authorized withdrawer. And we're designating a 10% commission. We also need to designate a fee pair. And I'm going to have our authorized withdrawer key pair pay, just to show you when you want to use an account and a key pair that is not stored on the device, you use this ask option. And then you can see it'll ask you for the key or for the seed phrase. Just entering the seed phrase here. It's going to ask me for passphrase. It's the shorter password that we entered when we created the account. Okay, so now our vote account is created. And next, we're going to start creating some of these system services as well as the startup script. So the startup script, we continue to use the sole user. And we'll create the file where the script will live. And here, all of the parameters of our script. And these couple additional flags I got from some folks on Discord who were discussing ways to optimize your validator for speed and making sure you're keeping up with the chain. And most of this stuff is on startup. I'm gonna make the script executable. And create a directory for the log file as we've referenced it in the startup script. And now we need to get into our non-root user with sudo privileges, which is where we'll create the systemd services. So the first service that we'll create is our validator service. And in here, you can see we have a couple environments. we have the path to our Solana binaries, which are obviously key for the operation of the validator, and also exposing some metrics, as well as the file path to our start validator script that we just created. Now we're going to create a system tuner service. Be honest, I'm not fully certain what this does, but by the name, I assume that it tunes the system. And we'll reload the daemon to make these changes. Next, we're going to set up log rotation. Solana log files can get pretty large, so we want to make sure that we're rotating them and not having our machine get messed up by collecting too many logs. Restart so this runs. Okay, and now it's time to start the validator. So first we enable and start the systuner service, because the validator references this service. You can see it's active and running. And now for the big moment, the validator service. See, it looks like it's running there. Clear this. And I've put some commands here that you can use to check if everything's working. It's a little more detailed. Give me much, but shows that it was successfully started and you've got your log file. Same with the systuner. I'll hold off on that. The meat of the monitoring commands will be found on your sole user. We've logged in here, and we will check ledger database to see how we're doing versus the chain. So still starting up, that's normal. One thing that has been pleasantly surprising to me, my experience with other blockchains, is you actually sync fairly quickly with the Solana chain. I mean, we're talking, inside of 15 minutes. And you can see here, something that I've gotten from discussion with other folks running is that if you are more than 3,000 or 4,000 blocks behind after starting your validator and you look using the Solana catch-up command, you're probably not going to catch up. And so you need to change some parameters or take a long, hard look at the hardware that you're using to see if it is actually spec'd to keep up with the blockchain. So looks like we're getting started well here. I like this command because if you're, not getting the right output here, you can see where the errors are. So this is just standard output stuff. But if you were seeing, errors, critical errors, they would be here. Errors in your connection, errors in, any of your services, anything like that. So now we'll run the Solana catch-up first. So we're pretty far behind. We'll give it a second. Otherwise, that we might need to restart our validator. That's definitely not typical. In the meantime, we can set up our stake account. And the stake account has a multi-account structure as well, with one account being critical, two accounts if you use the withdrawal authority, though I typically will keep my stake authority and withdrawal authority to the same account. So again, this is not something you want to store on your device. So I will do a no out file Solana keygen. And you want to store this somewhere safe. So I'm going to airdrop some SOL to this account. And next, we're going to create the stake account. It's largely, although the stake is here, largely a placeholder account. It doesn't have any abilities on its own. So not super important to keep it locked down. Okay, and just like we did with the vote account, there is a command that needs to be run to actually designate the account we just created as a stake account. And you can also choose how much SOL to put in the stake account, which will eventually be delegated. So since we only have one SOL in our stake authority account, I'm going to change this value to 0.5 instead of 1.5. So this is where we're designating the stake authority and withdrawal authority. Again, I'm just going to use the same account for both. And we also need to designate a fee pair. So maybe quite a few entries to process this transaction, but all of them are going to be the stake authority account. So we enter the seed phrase and the passphrase. Do the same for the withdrawal authority. Same for the fee pair. So, let's run that back. So we are going to run this command to create the stake account. And in doing so, we will designate our stake authority, our withdrawal authority, and how much we want to add to the stake account, which we will subsequently delegate to our validator. I think that worked. And yeah, so I was using the seed phrase and passphrase from the original stake authority account for all four of those. As you can see here, we generated our stake authority, withdrawal authority, used it for paying the fee, and also to send the SOL to the stake account. So once that transaction goes through, we can check on the stake account here. Clear that again. So you can see the stake account now has 0.5 SOL in it. It leaves a little as a rent exempt reserve. This is a Solana thing where you have a minimum balance to have an active Solana wallet. You can't just have a zero balance. So you can see the stake account is undelegated. We have not selected a delegator, and so therefore we're not earning rewards on this yet. So the next step would be to delegate the stake and point it towards our vote account. But we need to make sure that we have caught up to the chain. So I'm going to go back and check on that. So as I mentioned, and this is probably a good example, I think maybe tutorials are a little bit more interesting when you have to troubleshoot during them. So as I mentioned, if you're this far behind, it's unlikely that you will catch up to the chain. So the best course of action is to restart and try again. And so I'm going to start with that. And if that doesn't work, then we will dig in a little bit deeper and see what we need to change to catch up to the chain. So to do so, we're going to exit back to our user where the systemd service, the validator service, is actually running. So using this command, we'll see status of our validator service. It's running. And I'm now going to stop this service. So this can happen for any number of reasons. It could be something in my config. It could be to do with the validators, the known validators that I'm grabbing my snapshot of the blockchain. Check the memory is looking. So yeah, 7.5 gigs. This should be significantly larger. It's showing me that we haven't downloaded much of the chain. Another good thing to do if you do run into some issues is to check the Discord and see if there are any issues on the cluster. I definitely have had some times where I was racking my brain thinking I was doing something wrong, and it turned out that the cluster was having some issues. So this guy's asking, is the testnet alive? Looks like someone is saying they're back. Also check the Explorer. So we're still looking like this is the most recent slot. We're here. Looks like we're a little far behind. All right, this might take a little deeper troubleshooting than this tutorial is prepped for. So I'm going to stop the recording here. All right, so we're back after a lot of very cursory troubleshooting, mostly just restarting the validator service, poring over the start validator script that we have. You see right here in front of me. I changed a couple parameters. I got rid of the only known RPC. That was really the main change that I made. But ultimately, what ended up working was I just did a sudo reboot, rebooted the entire machine. For those who are used to cloud infrastructure, it takes a little while for the full reboot to take place for these machines, at least using the Lumen machine. It takes about 5 or 6 minutes. So I gave the machine a chance to reboot. And when I logged back in, the validator had caught up, so that seemed to do it. Perhaps not the most satisfying answer, but sometimes just turn it off and turn it back on. That's the best thing that you can do. A lot of folks in the Discord, I had gone through, and it looked like there was a little hiccup earlier this morning. Perhaps that was what was jamming up my validator from syncing originally. But the startup seemed to do it. I changed my startup script and my validator parameters back to exactly what you see here, restarted the validator. And as you can see, we do seem to be caught up. And so now that we are caught up, we can complete the process delegating stake from our stake account that we created a little while ago. So I've got the structure of the command as well as how it's going to manifest for us. So I'm going to make some changes, listing our new vote account address that we also created earlier. You can see here's my vote account address. I'll be asking for the key pair of my stake authority, and then also designating a fee pair, which will also be the stake authority. And there you have it. So you can see we've delegated the stake. It's activating. Solana has both a warm up and a cool down period, which I believe happens in 25% increments over the course of a couple days. This 0.5, just less than 0.5 SOL that we've delegated to our validator will make its way in there, and then we will start earning rewards both in our stake account for the stake that we have delegated to the validator, as well as on our validator, which we will see in the vote account. So yeah, that's it. I'm not going to go through a monitoring setup. I'll probably do that in a separate video, but that's kind of a step-by-step how you set up a validator on the Solana testnet. And a couple things that we encountered that are super common and, are things that seasoned validators are dealing with are, the catch up and optimizing your partitions, optimizing your hardware really is where Solana validation lives and dies. Certainly, I have some experience in networking and have run across other blockchains. None of them are as hardware intensive as Solana. And, they give you really high functioning machines if you go through the server program, but there is still a good bit of knowledge that you should have if you're going to optimize these machines, if you're going to look out for problems, because it's definitely not a set it and forget it type of blockchain. It's still early on. There's updates happening all the time. And the Discord has been a pretty helpful place for me where when I was running into certain roadblocks, I was able to figure out which ones were errors that I was making and which were more common errors that are, just part of doing business on Solana. So hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you have any comments in the comments, and I'll see you next time.